experience as their child really tried their best to create a different world for me and my siblings. They wanted to make sure that, for example, favoritism didn't exist. They wanted to make sure that we could communicate, and that not only did the siblings, that as siblings we had a good relationship, but as children and parents, we had a relationship where we could communicate and just kind of express our feelings. I always joke that I'm the firecracker child, that I was going to say whatever I wanted to say anyway from birth. There are lots of stories that I'll share later about just how I am as a child. So there's like stories of me being 4 years old and my uncle drinking apple juice in the car. And at the time in the 80s, there was a lot of don't drink and drive commercials. And I was 4 years old and I didn't really understand what those commercials meant. But I was just like, you're not going to drink and drive with me. So this is the child that they birthed where I'm 4 and I'm arguing with an adult that you absolutely will not be drinking and driving with me in the vehicle. But I say all that to say that, like, my parents didn't slap me. My uncle didn't slap me for just being adamant. They really tried to communicate and help me understand. But I say all that to say that they were raised differently. That is a situation where an adult may have dismissed you. Yeah. You're 4 years old. You don't understand what's talking about. Shut up. Or if you're talking back, you may, be hit. Right. Things like that. So they made a conscious effort to raise us differently. And the same for me. When I found out I was pregnant with my daughter, who was 13 years old, I remember coming to my mom and my dad and talking to them about things that I witnessed with them and things that I experienced and things that I didn't want to pass down. I'm like, there's a lot of good that I want to take, but there are also things that I don't want to repeat. And I think without getting into too much detail about things that I loved or things that I don't want to repeat, I think the most important thing of how we arrived here at this episode is I started to realize, especially within the last month or so, that there are things that you subconsciously repeat, that you don't have a desire to hurt your children the same way you were hurt as a child, or to hurt your partner the way you may have witnessed one parent being hurt, or even yourself being hurt in a previous relationship. But subconsciously, I found myself operating in a way that I wasn't happy with. Because like I said, my parents set out to not pass on certain things. And I did the same thing. I set out to not pass on certain traits. So on today's episode, we wanted to talk about emotional triggers and spiritual trauma and how energy can kind of linger. And just kind of acknowledge how impactful your childhood is on all of your relationships. We're just going to focus on intimate relationships, but it affects how you allow people to treat you at work. It affects how you allow your friends to treat you. It affects how you interact as a parent, how you interact as a partner. And I don't think that that's talked about enough. And how it affects you on a subconscious level. You find yourself repeating patterns that you specifically said you would not repeat. So for me, the biggest thing that I've noticed is I've had a very stressful time after COVID. Many of us in the world have. And I just found myself being a lot more angry, struggling with anxiety more, struggling with depression more. And even though I haven't been diagnosed with anything, that's not the point. You know when you're not operating at your best self. Right. My mom could see it, my dad could see it, my child, everyone around me could see you're not shining and operating at the same level. And it's affected me even relaunching the podcast because I didn't want to be on film talking about anything. I didn't feel like I was in a place to talk about it. And I'm very grateful to have my parents here because they're here saying, no, you must. Life is never going to be perfect. You must push forward. So I guess the first question I'll ask both of you, I'll start with my mom and go to my dad, is what did it feel like for you to say, I don't want to repeat certain things and realize that you are repeating certain things as an individual? Because both of you made a commitment to yourself that you weren't going to repeat certain things. And then you found yourself through your own way repeating that. So we can start with that. And then you can talk about how it affects you as a person and then how it affects you in your relationship.
Well, first of all, I'd like to talk about what we call capital punishment. That's something that's as most of us know, growing up in the Caribbean and West Africa, that I've observed myself, is that capital punishment, beating a child,
Corporal.
Corporal. Oh, thank you for the correction.
Yeah, but I understand.
Corporal punishment. Oh my gosh, is something that permeates the cultures in the Caribbean and West Africa. And I made a commitment or a promise to myself that I would not do that to my children, because I remember how I felt. My father beat me with his bare hands once, and I was conscious that he really did not want to do that. But what I did was deserving of the beating. However, the way it happened was very embarrassing to me because of the age I was, number one, and number two, he did it outside in the yard in front of the neighbors. So that was very embarrassing for me. And I know I would not want to do that to my children, and especially to my girl children. However, what I found that happened to me was that whenever I was exhausted and frustrated and angry with my life, as it turned out in Tennessee when my family migrated, I was working 3 jobs. My husband was in medical school. I was in a foreign country that was racist, and a state that was also racist. Correct. Going into communities where people would slam doors in my face, ask questions for directions, and I became angry in an insidious way. I wasn't even recognizing that I was. So by the time I had my 3rd child, I was overwhelmed. My husband was still in med school, and there were days that I was so exhausted that I could not even understand my own self. So there were a few times that I can remember consciously beating my oldest son in a way that was not deserving of that type of punishment, but I recognized it was coming out of my exhaustion and my frustration. Looking back, I remember the situation with my dad, and it was very similar in that he was very angry, very frustrated at the time when he did it. Now, Mark, I didn't take my son outside in the yard and beat him in front of the neighbors, but I could pull on that energy of being at a point in my life where I thought I could manage everything well, and clearly I wasn't, because we didn't have enough help. We didn't have enough, what I considered a supportive family at that time to help me. Now, of course, people looking on would say, "Oh, but you're fortunate. You live in, near your family." But that, I don't want to go into that. But I just have to admit that I really was not emotionally prepared to manage my family at that stage in my life. And so what I did, I can now look back and recognize that it was not a healthy approach. I later on in life could look at my children and apologize for anything that I did that was offensive to their spirit, because my toxic energy should not permeate them. And I did not want that to pass on to my grandchildren. And I think that is where the healing started for me, and that it is very important for parents to be able to recognize when they're toxic and to be able to work with it and address it even with their children.
Right. And I think, to be fair, in the 80s and the 90s, understanding that we needed emotional support, because you had people that would, I remember going to aunt's house and cousin's house to stay, but that's different than, are you okay emotionally?
Right.
You know?
Right.
Like, literally, are you okay emotionally? Because sometimes it's deeper than just a break away from your children. Mm-hmm. You literally may need to go to the river and just rest, or go to look at a mountain, or do something that's just for yourself.
Right.
That has nothing to do, maybe not even anything to do with your partner, something to regenerate your energy. And I don't think that was really, it's popular now.
It is popular now.
But I don't think that was really popular in the 80s and 90s for men or women. Men tend to like go play golf or go play soccer or whatever and kind of decompress. But as women, we weren't like, let me do something to take care of my spirit specifically.
Right. We were not really given the opportunity to do that, especially if you are in the childbearing stage and working. A lot of us had young children and we were working. We weren't allowed to stay home because
that's true.
It wasn't
even a thing.
It wasn't even a thing. You had to work.
Yes.
I mean, when I had you, for example, we had someone that came in, and may she continue to ascend peacefully, who came every day, took the bus to come and be there with us and ensure that I could go to school and do what I needed to do and come back. When we moved to Tennessee, even though we were close to family, it was a different energy.
Yes.
And the kind of care that we needed, it was not there. The emotional care is what I'm speaking to. It wasn't there. And I also saw toxicity in my family there in Tennessee that created more problems for me.
Because you were going into a different family. You weren't going to Tennessee to be with your family. You were technically both of you were going to be with family
that were strangers.
You didn't know because you weren't raised by. My father was raised by his grandparents, for context.
Right.
And they moved from Jamaica to Tennessee to live with his parents, but his parents didn't raise him.
Right. We didn't know that.
And so they didn't know me, and
you didn't know them.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. And it comes to a point that I think is important, where how people impact you depends on, to a large extent, what kind of relationship that you've had with them. So if someone says something to you and you already have a supportive existing relationship, it's going to be received much differently than the same thing being said to you by somebody that you essentially don't know.
That is very true.
And so I think
whether it's loving or critical,
it's
just hard to process in a certain way.
And I think sometimes with parents, what happens is that they are your parents and they see themselves as your parents and have always seen you as their child. And if they missed out on some part of your childhood, they kind of want to make up for it. You know, when you're with them once again. The problem is that if you never had them in that parental role, the way that they're expecting you to relate to them, you may not relate to them in that way because that's not who you are accustomed to relating to in that way. In my case, my grandparents were the ones that I related to as parents. Right. And so it created some amount of misunderstanding.
Yes.
You know, because my grandparents had a particular way of dealing with me that was different from how my parents dealt with me. And although now, as a parent myself, I can look back and understand some of what my parents were trying to do. As a child, I didn't. You know, so something that was very simple, for example, like when I was in high school, I made the track team of my high school, which was considered to be a big thing back then.
Jamaica, still now.
Right.
They love track.
And the team was having a party, a celebration party because we had won championships. And the family was having a gathering. And I wanted to go to the championship party that my school was having. And my father said, no, the family's going somewhere, so you're coming. And for me, as a child who had not really grown up in the context of that was not my parent that I was accustomed to.
Right.
Then that seemed to be quite unreasonable to me. Right? And I was rebelling against it. And now as an adult, I can look back and I can see, oh, my father was just trying to stress the importance of family to me. But it didn't make any sense to me at that point in time because this is not someone who, I mean, although coming up, family was always important. They would always take me to the country to meet, you know, relatives and what have you. It was still different because it's not someone that I grew up with. And that made such a difference. So how it ended up affecting me was that sometimes I didn't learn how to express myself properly and to speak how I felt about a given situation, because in the context of how my father was, and I mean this had to do with the society, it's like they would tell you children should be seen and not heard.
He told us that too as his
Right.
grandkids.
Right.
God rest Grandpa Bassel's soul. Yeah, I definitely heard that.
So children should be seen and not heard
Was a very common thing.
Very common thing. And
but to be fair, Grandpa Bassel was born in 1918.
Right.
For context to all the listeners.
So the
which
problem,
means his parents were born in the 1800s.
Right.
You know. So.
And so they were coming from a totally different era and framework.
Right.
And to be fair, there were things present in the society at that point in time where, although children weren't allowed to have a voice per se, there were advocates for the children who would speak on their behalf, because children were protected much more so by the family,
yes.
by the grandparents and the cousins and the aunties and the uncles who would speak on the children's behalf.
Yeah.
But as the more westernized we became, the more we became families that
separating too. Yeah, we weren't clan
an extended
blocks.
family.
Right.
Then the less protection that you had. So not being seen and not heard eventually meant not having a voice. And not having a voice is never a good thing for a human being. So if you feel like you can't be heard, then sometimes you respond to it in different ways. Some people respond to it by just being totally rebellious. Some people respond to it by not talking,
right,
or not speaking up for themselves, or by learning to find other ways of expressing themselves, which may not necessarily be healthy. Right. So the problem is that you carry those things forward with you into your relationship.
Right. So
as an adult.
Can I ask you, as a kind of a redirection, can I ask you, what are some things, like Mom talked about, corporal punishment, that something that you did not want to repeat, but under stress, you inevitably went that route.
Right.
So are there things that you remember, like, this wasn't pleasant for my childhood, I'm not going to do that looking back, you ended up repeating? Well, and what do you think were the surrounding circumstances?
Well, I mean, there's some things that, myself and your mom decided that we did not want to do, which is, for example, we did not want to necessarily send our children to our grandparents,
right,
to the grandparents for them to raise. We wanted to raise our children ourselves.
Right, but that's a little different, because you never sent us away. I'm talking about something that you looked back and was like, I actually did this on a subconscious level. Consciously, I have no intention of repeating this behavior, but subconsciously, I repeated it. You have to think harder to
I have to think harder to dig out. But what I do know is that in my spirit, I wanted to be, one of my goals was to be a better father to my children than my father was to me. That may sound like a strange goal, but that's what I want to go, that I set out to do.
What did that look like for you then?
For me,
what needs did you say you were going to fill for us that you felt were missing for you? Maybe that's a better question.
Okay, so for me, that meant, when, like I said, for example, I made a track team in high school. My father never came and saw me play or do any kind of sports at any point in time. Okay. And so what I did was I tried to at least be a part of you guys' sporting activities. Okay. I may not have been as much as some of the parents did, but I made an effort to do that. And part of it was because of what I went through and how I experienced it. I think what I recognize is that an area that I didn't do a better job than my father, I did probably the same kind of job, was that talking with my sons about things related to being a man and things related to. I don't think, in retrospect, I did as good a job of that as I ought to have done. That's my perspective.
Okay, so that would be something that, as a son, you wanted more input on just being a human being,
right,
and being a man,
right,
and you wanted to give that to your children,
right, and
you don't feel like you gave what you wanted to.
No,
in the developmental age, because now
right,
we talk and we're
right,
operating a little differently,
right,
but yes,
so
at the developmental age. So can you think of what was going on, like the stress of being in medical school and the stress of being a husband and the stress of living in a new country? Can you think of why you may not have been able to carve out time for that?
All of the above. Because sometimes in order to be able to give that kind of input, you really have to have a relationship with your children that says you can see them and you can see what's taking place with them and feel their energy and see when their energy is off or when they're upset or when
right.
So you can tap into it and then ask questions. So for me, I feel like I didn't do as good a job of that as I would have liked to have done. I think nowadays I am a little better in terms of relating to my children, but this is like after years. And part of the reason was just from my position, not being able to hear the feedback coming from like you, my children, and my wife about how I was operating.
Right.
Because for me, at one point in time, I was so intent on trying to provide for the family that I was like, I had blinders on. And so I didn't properly examine how my attempts to provide for the family was in fact impacting the family. And
now I can, as your child, tell you that you're impacted by that because that's what you experienced. Mm-hmm. So grandma and grandpa left Jamaica to go to Tennessee to provide a better life. Yeah. And for all intents and purposes, they did. But the psychological and emotional impact on you was extremely detrimental to your spirit. I don't think it affected Uncle Junior or Auntie Donna in the same way.
It didn't, because they're different.
They're different beings. People. Yeah.
And also, they came at different times.
That's true. That's true. Yeah.
Because Donna, my sister, grew up with them.
Okay.
Right? And spent most of her life growing up with them. My brother and myself grew up with our grandparents.
Right.
My brother knew my mother before she left.
Right. You have no relationship whether you were sent to Jamaica at 10 months. Yeah.
So it makes a difference in terms of, because I've sat down with my siblings and had discussions with them about how each one of them was impacted by our parents, and it's almost like we grew up with different parents.
Right. And I know the same is true for you and Auntie Charmaine. Yeah, the same is true in terms of your experience of your parents is different than Auntie Charmaine. And for me and my siblings, I know for me, I'm 10 years older than my sister, and I feel like my experience is different than hers with you. You and Dad you had more money, you had more support. Miss Marcy, you had a live-in support that was helping.
Live-in support.
You had
more wisdom too.
That's true. You finished medical school. All these things affected how my younger siblings were parented over how I was parented, and the brother that's closest in age to me were parented. And so for me, I feel like one of the patterns that I'm thinking about that I don't want to repeat has caused me to not really progress with this podcast, because I also am hyper-focused on providing and making sure that I'm making all the money I can make, and I get very stressed if I have any financial instability, and that affects how I handle my child. I can remember one really bad outburst that I had my child was 5 years old, and I instantly caught myself because I realized I was reacting out of stress. And I remember in that moment deciding that it doesn't matter how stressed I am. It doesn't matter even if I think she deserves a spanking, because she has gotten spanking since then, that I'm going to approach it in a totally different way. And I think she's only gotten one other spanking since that time, and she knows why that happened. And as a family, we talked about why this happened and the importance of it. But just like my parents decided that corporal punishment was not a path that they chose, I also opted to communicate with her and explain things to her. And no television, no hanging out with your friends. There are other ways you can get through to a child without corporal punishment. But in terms of pursuing some of my natural gifts, I feel like I struggle with that because I want to make sure that I'm providing. But the flip side of it is, when you're not walking in your purpose or doing what you're supposed to do, that can create sadness and anxiety within you, which can create stress, which means it's going to affect your parenting anyway.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, yes, it's funny how you just say, okay, these are things that I don't want to repeat, but subconsciously you are. So for me, being highly stressed, especially this summer, with trying to do certain things, I really started to look at myself and ask myself, why am I hurting my child the same way that I was hurt? Meaning that, like, why am I repeating certain things? And looking at how I want to parent and the conscious choices that I made. And the like you said, reacting out of stress, you're just like, I don't, you're yelling. You're very short. Your child is asking you a question and you're just like,
you're not listening.
Yeah.
You're not even hearing the question.
Or you're irritated that your child is asking you a question. Right. Number one, that's what children do. And then you also know your child specifically. You know if your child is very inquisitive. You probably encourage it on a good day.
Yeah.
You want them to ask questions, but when you're stressed, it's like, why are you asking me questions? And it's like learning to take a step back and communicate. I'm having a bad day. It has nothing to do with you, sweetheart. I'm having a tough day. And kind of dialing it back. And when I started the podcast, I remember saying, I'm going to share my journey of healing and, life after divorce, dating, and the things that I'm doing to love myself and become a better partner. But I didn't really think about what that looked like in a healthy way. So looking back to 2018, I think I just said, okay, well, I'm not going to think about this stuff, and I'm going to go with the flow, and I'm just going to do all these things, and I'm going to love differently. I'm not going to have expectations. I'm going to do all these things differently. And what I've learned now 5 years later is that your childhood is going to come, no matter what kind of relationship you try to get into, your childhood is going to come up. I don't really care what you say, marriage, situationship, boyfriend, girlfriend, even just somebody that you just only have sex with. There's going to come a point where rejection becomes an issue. Communication becomes an issue. All these things that you say you don't care about because you don't want to love somebody becomes an issue. Or even asking yourself, why don't I want to deal with love? You have to ask yourself, why do you want to operate like that?
Can I say something about love? I think a lot of times people have a misconception about what love means. And then when people act in a truly loving way, it becomes difficult for people to accept. If I love you and I see you doing something that is detrimental to you, I'm going to point that out to you. Now, how do you receive that?
Right.
I can speak personally because there were some times when my wife would speak to me and talk to me about things that I was doing that were detrimental to me, that she, because of her love for me, saw me doing and said, sweetie pie, where I took it like a criticism. I took it like, why am I being criticized? Why am I being put down? And that again had to do with childhood and how I received criticism as a child and what it did to me and my spirit. So then I had to look at, something, if somebody loves you, they're going to talk to you about some things that are painful and hurtful sometimes. Because if they love you, they want to see you be better.
Right.
And if it means that in order for you to be better, you got to work through something, then they're going to talk about it. So sometimes when we say we love somebody and that person says something to us that really hits us hard, instead of just being reactive and being mad and angry, and why are you talking to me about this? Stop and consider, this person loves me, right? Because I'm not talking about people who say things in a harsh, toxic way.
There's a difference, yeah.
Right. But this person loves me,
Yeah.
so let me stop and consider, something? Let me really examine and see what is this that is being said to me. Because in reality, sometimes we are in the relationship with that person so that that person can help us and so that we can help that person. It means talking to them about things that are painful and listening to them when they talk to us about things
because
that
nobody
are
is
painful.
perfect. Yes.
None of us are perfect.
Yeah.
And if I'm going to grow and develop and become a better human being, then I need to be able to hear what somebody who cares about me is saying that may be critical, and understand that criticism is not coming from a place of destructiveness, but coming from a place of constructiveness.
And I'm glad we talked about love and went straight to the critical, because everyone loves to talk about the good parts of love. Like, we're going on vacations together. We laugh at the same movies, and we're equally yoked financially or in terms of ambition and things like that. But the truth of the matter is that no matter how great you are or how compatible you are, you're two individuals that were raised by different households, and you're going to see things differently. And getting through those things matter. Bringing children into the equation makes it even worse.
Yes.
For example, I could be a meat eater and I could be dating a vegan. We can live together blissfully until the end of time. When you have children, are the children going to be meat eaters or vegan? People get very visceral in terms of their reaction to, my children cannot only be vegan, or my children must eat meat. So just things like that bring up that same pattern of how are we going to communicate, how are we going to raise these children. So I do believe that being a parent changes the dynamic of love even more.
Absolutely.
So, Mom, what are your thoughts on love and conflict and how your childhood impacted that?
Well, I was confused about love in my teen years. I can look back at that and say honestly, I thought I knew, but I didn't.
What did you think love was in your teen years? That's a good question.
Yeah, in my teen years, I thought love was you see somebody, you like them, you go places together, and then you end up having a family, and that's it. It's not until I got married, even though I saw my parents married, I didn't understand their expressions of love, because love is expressed in so many different ways, and it's not just about the family that raised you, it's also about the language that you create with each other as a couple.
That's powerful.
And the things that my parents did that became their language, and there's a book called The 5 Love Languages, by the way, but there are things that my parents did that I now recognize was their love language, that I didn't know it as such, then observing and looking on. And for example, my father never lived with us an entire week. For 25 years, he worked in rural Jamaica and was only with us on the weekends, Friday through Sunday night. Monday morning, 4 a.m., he was gone. However, he always brought something home. Whether it be fresh meat from the farm where they go kill a cow, or some yam and some plantain, he never came home empty-handed, in other words. That was his way of expressing his love to his wife. I may not have cash money to give you,
Right.
but I got something that I know can feed us
Right.
and the family. That was his way of expressing his love. However, for her, money was important. And they had disagreements over money. And she never understood that him providing the food and having a house that she didn't pay the mortgage for, because he paid the mortgage. I'm not saying she didn't contribute to the house.
Yeah, I understand.
I want to be very clear about that, because she worked, she was a teacher, became a principal, and had her little businesses on the side. And she contributed heavily to maintaining the home and maintaining a beautiful home.
Right.
But in terms of owning property, that was his foremost vision. Always focused on that and providing food for the family. But she was the person who loved to have cash to do so many other things. And she felt that he didn't demonstrate his love by handing her money every week. She saw that bringing the food was okay, but she wanted to have this cash. Now, I had to then examine that in my own marriage, because I was in a different situation where for 4 years of our marriage, I was the primary breadwinner. No, not the only, but the primary. And so therefore, I didn't have that luxury of somebody coming home and giving cash or even bringing food, because we had to work together to ensure that we feed the family, and it was a whole different scenario.
Right.
So I had to learn a different love language and understand a different expression from my husband. For him, if he stayed home and helped to cook, that was his expression of love.
This is why you were in medical school, I'm assuming?
Yes.
Okay.
Right. So he may have a big exam tomorrow, and I'm so overwhelmed and stressed after driving 200 miles to Red Boiling Springs and Hanwell, Tennessee, and then come home to a new baby. I couldn't function. So his way of saying, I want you to know that I really care, was, okay, I'll stay and help to cook the dinner and put the children to bed. Right. But then he was gone to study. And so someone looking on may say, well, how do you live with that? Because he's not home with you. But I had to learn to accept that as his way of expressing his love, because there was no other way. We couldn't afford someone to be there to stay with the baby for us to go off together. For example, he had to go study, or he couldn't, really function if the child is home crying 3-4 times in the night.
For context, my brother Jelani was a newborn when you started.
Newborn, 2 days after he started med school.
So there was an actual baby. I was I was 3 years.
Yeah,
I was 3 years old. I was 3 going on 4.
Right.
And my brother was a newborn, and they had moved to a new country.
Yes.
America, racist country, and then Tennessee, racist state.
Right. So I later on had to put that in a different context and learn what that meant. Was that his way of expressing his love? Did I understand it then? No, I didn't. Okay. And I felt that I didn't have him expressing his love to me in a way that he ought to, as opposed to saying, hey, he came home, made sure that you were fed, helped with the dinner. I mean, later on, I had to process it differently. Right. But the kinds of things that women are shown and have this false impression of love, an expression of love, I didn't get that. My husband wasn't the kind of say, oh, you're beautiful. Oh, I love how you look today. You have a nice body. You have nice legs. That wasn't a common expression from him.
So I want to pause there. Mm-hmm. So you needed that. Did you ever express to him that you needed that?
Eventually.
Okay. And then I want to ask you, did you ever see your father or your grandfather expressing that to their wives?
Right.
So you didn't even have a context of this is what you do as a husband, because you didn't see husbands doing that.
No.
Right. So I
never saw
a powerful.
I never saw my father do it. I never saw any of my uncles do it. There's nobody that I saw in my ambit that was doing that.
That does, okay.
And if I may just say quickly, he mentioned uncles. Now, my uncles were that way.
Oh my God, Uncle John still,
Yeah.
to this
So
day.
I had an uncle
Yeah.
that will just shower you with adoration, you know? So he will shower you with adoration. Oh, you look beautiful today, my niece. Oh, I love those shorts on you. Oh, look at those legs, you know? So he did that for my spirit. I had another uncle who was big on education and being self-sufficient. And he had me working in his business from I was 13 and pushed me in that direction to be self-sufficient. And anytime I did anything that he thought was good, he would praise me highly. Right. I didn't get that from my husband initially. Right. I mean, one of the things that stood out in my mind was that when I graduated from PT school, to this day, my husband never said, "I'm proud of you that you had a baby and then final year of school finished." Me, I was the baby. Right. And I'm so proud that you were able to achieve that. He never used those words. Right. You know, and as a wife, you know, and a mother at the time, those are the kinds of things we wanted to hear and that I needed to hear. And, you know, it was very difficult for me to navigate what is love in the infant stages of my marriage.
So I think the show that I watch, Couples Therapy, this comes up a lot, and I want to ask, we can kind of wrap up the discussion by asking this question. When we think about our childhood and how we filter information, and we think about the needs that we enter into a relationship with, how did you and Dad decide we're going to work through these needs and work on our union? Because you needed things from him that he didn't even know you needed and didn't even see. Like, he didn't even know that it was something that people needed. And likewise, he may have needed things from you that you didn't know that he needed, and he never communicated. Right. And that brings a lot of conflict and resentment, because you think, this person loves me and feels all of these other needs. Why aren't you feeling this need that I didn't articulate? Right.
And
so how do you navigate that?
It also makes the union vulnerable, because sometimes other people will come and see that these things are lacking or missing, and want to capitalize on it and want to create problems in the union. And
it could be intentional or unintentional. Sometimes people are coming in intentionally, and sometimes it's unintentional. Right. But I think what I'm really talking or speaking to is, are these childhood needs that we have that, like you said, I want to be praised, or I want to feel financially secure, or I want to make sure that I have a strong emotional connection with my partner, because that's very important to me. How do you even begin to resolve understanding that we all enter relationships with these needs, and, like you said, begin to, because at a certain point you all had to talk to each other and say, this is what I need, and then within yourself you had to say, I need to work on myself so that I can give my partner this, because I love them and I want them in my life. Right.
You know, that really is, I would say, a difficult one to answer. Like right now, because it was developed over time.
It's ongoing.
It's
of course it's ongoing. That's the first answer. It's ongoing. It doesn't end. It's ongoing. Yeah.
We got to a point where we realized, okay, if we really love and care for each other, are we going to just shelve this thing and move on with our lives separately? Or can we really look at each other and say, okay, we can walk this walk together?
And how do you think your childhood affects that decision-making process? Because we're talking about how everything that you experience affects how you're even going to communicate, or what communicating a need makes you feel like. Because I know that that's going to come up for you.
Yes.
You specifically spoke to, when I was a child, I spoke up and it wasn't even dealt with. It wasn't acknowledged. It wasn't addressed. So it was hard for you to speak up. For you, what childhood obstacles did you have to overcome?
I had to overcome that. I don't think my parents communicated well with each other when I was in my teen years.
Okay, so
And
when you think you know what love is as a teenager, you're looking at your parents and seeing the dynamic.
And seeing the dynamic. So it was very difficult for me to balance the two because I saw a lot of conflict. Not only even with my parents, I saw with aunts and uncles too. So I had to, make peace with that and try to find my way into having a peaceful marriage, or what I thought would be a peaceful marriage.
Right.
When I realized that I too was running into some of the same challenges that my parents had, where we had conflicts. How do you resolve this? Then I recognized that we needed help. And would say, we need help. Are we going to get help for this? And I think when someone can say, I need help, or we need help, that's the first sign of love and caring for someone else. Because you're saying to that person, I'm not saying to you, I want to run away from this. I want us to look at this. How can we fix this? Can we fix this? And that's what I would say is the answer for everyone. No, not everything is fixable. I'm not saying that. It got to come from in here. You got to want to fix it.
That's true.
You're going to want to fix it. And if it's not repairable, which can happen, there are some relationships that are just extremely toxic, and that's it. You can't really repair it.
So, I think to get to the point of it being irreparable, it really is when people don't have regard and respect for each other.
I think that's the root of it, yes.
Because if people
simultaneously, thank you.
If people have respect,
producer, my child is telling us the time.
If people have respect for each other, then what happens is that even when unpleasant things have to be faced, or unpleasant things have to be said, or difficult things have to be faced, or difficult things have to be said, if people are able to say them with respect, then that is what enables people to work through challenges, is when people are saying things in a hurtful, harmful, vindictive, oppressive way. That's when, that what leads to fracture in a relationship, as far as I'm concerned.
So, to kind of wrap it on up, I believe the question was, how do you feel like your childhood affected the needs that you have in your marriage in terms of how you're communicating what you need, and also your willingness to give your partner what they need? Because I think sometimes what we don't talk about, which is something that I struggle with, is if you feel like your needs are not being met, then you don't want to meet anyone else's needs. However, the root of the issue is, did you communicate your need?
So I think again, once respect is there, then it leaves the door open for communication to be effective, because it's difficult to have effective communication without respect.
That's true.
So if I can't hear what you're saying because I don't respect you as a human being, then it's difficult to get movement.
Well, let me ask that. I know we have to wrap up, but another thing that I think really burns, especially me, sometimes you feel like someone does not respect you, but that may not be true. Sometimes you are triggered and they are triggered. And so I think that's where the childhood comes into play, which is, you didn't do this one particular thing, and this triggers a deep emotional wound for me. I feel like you're being disrespectful. To a rational person, maybe it's not disrespectful, but I feel disrespectful because I told you I don't like it, and you're doing it. So
sometimes I would say that's where a third neutral party can become very helpful, because sometimes a third neutral party can be able to say, what does this really mean? Because the way that you're responding to it is not commensurate with what is actually being said.
Right, or what's happening.
Or what's actually happening. So,
and that's not to say that your partner cannot do things that irritate you, but I really want to talk about things that disturb you to your core and you do feel disrespected, but maybe when you seek counseling or you talk to someone else, they're like, I can understand why you're bothered, and I can understand that you've repeated yourself, but in a relationship, you have to repeat yourself. Mm-hmm. And then also, you have to think about...
Do you see any movement?
That's true.
If the person was over here
right.
last week, and now they're here, but they still haven't...
They're not perfect.
Perfect.
And right. They'll never be perfect. That I think we should start there. No one's ever going to be perfect.
But they have moved.
Correct. How do you handle that?
If they used to do something 50 times for the month and they're now doing it 5, that's movement.
Yes.
So if you can recognize movement, then, because when they used to do it 50 times, it would irritate you 50 times.
Absolutely.
When they do it 5 times, it's still going to irritate you 5 times. But if you can recognize, yes, there's movement, it means the person has made an effort to say, you say you don't like this thing, I made an effort. I'm not perfect, but I made an effort not to be the places I used to be.
Right.
Consciously, I made an effort to say, I'm going to do something differently. And that is really also respect.
It is. It is. And I think to kind of wrap it all up, it sounds like stress absolutely impacts your relationship. Mm-hmm. It impacts sometimes repeating things that you don't want to repeat on a subconscious level.
Yes.
And it also makes you realize, you know what, my parents and my grandparents and their grandparents were all reacting in a way based on stress. Yeah, that's what we're going to wrap it up. But yeah, we were all reacting in a way based on stress. So with that understanding, we all have to be respectful and navigate life and tread lightly. And what I try to introduce in my romantic relationship now is really, really check in with your partner and understand their capacity level. Because that will help you as you're navigating. Like, if you had a tough day, let me know. Mm-hmm. If you were stressed, let me know. Because I don't need to be on top of you like you took too long to answer my text. Yes. Or you didn't remember to do this. Or you don't remember that I told you I want to go to this show because you had a bad day. Right. So we're going to close the episode, and I want to just thank my parents for joining me and helping me relaunch the podcast. And I don't know if anyone else wants to wrap up, but I just want to thank both of you for being here and encouraging me and supporting me. I really appreciate both of you.
Thank you for having us, and I know in my spirit that you're going to soar with these podcasts. I think it's needed, yes. and that there's so much we can bring to the table that will be helpful and healing to others.
And whenever you need us, we're on that phone call away.
Yes. And technology can allow us to
That's true. We can have more conversations.
Yes.
All right. That's a wrap.
All right.
Yes.